Welcome everyone to our latest talk in the series New Voices on Eurasia, sponsored by PONARS Eurasia. For those of you whose first time is today, this is a monthly talk series taking place all academic year long, so we're about halfway done right now, inviting junior and younger scholars working in the region, political science, sociology, economics, across multiple disciplines, to come and share their research to a DC audience. So it's a kind of an opportunity to think broadly about some of the questions they've been grappling with, and also expose them to a new type of question, maybe policy oriented or otherwise here in DC. So today we're thrilled to have Guzel Garifullina from Stanford University, a CDDR postdoctoral scholar. Guzel received a PhD from the University of North Carolina a couple years back, Chapel Hill, and does a ton of work on municipal government and political economy and related issues. She's going to be sharing a talk today about bureaucracy at the subnational level, and we're just thrilled to have Guzel here sharing her thoughts and her research with us today. So, Guzel, thank you very much, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for the kind introduction, and thank you to the organizers of this talk series for the opportunity to present my work to a diverse audience. I'm very excited about that. I'm looking forward to hearing your questions. Feel free to ask any clarifying questions in the process. I'll be happy to address those. If I feel that some of the clarifying questions require kind of deeper discussion, we might divert them for the Q&A section of the talk. All right, so today I will be talking, this is the name of my today's talk, people behind the scenes, and I will be talking about the human face of the Russian state, a little bit of an unusual take. Normally, when we think about Russian politics, we either think about Putin and some of the maybe cronies at the top level, or we think about some kind of unified state machine. But I really want to take a deeper look inside this state machine and see what kind of individuals actually compose this machine and what that means for the decision-making and policy.
Probably switch to Zoom. You need to switch it back to PowerPoint.
All right. So actually here on the slide, you already see a few of the faces. Maybe some of you recognize some of them, like Khabarovsk Governor of Furgal, or potentially Klein here in the middle, who was the currently last elected mayor of Tomsk. Tomsk being the most important city that abolished the mayoral elections altogether. But anyway, these are the faces of individuals that compose the Russian state. And in today's talk, I will try to answer a series of questions. The first one is, what kinds of people are more likely to end up in the positions of authority in Russia? Local positions of authority, right? Accordingly, I will be paying special attention to institutions that place them there, and trying to answer the question, are those institutions promoting good or bad types of people into those positions? And finally, I will briefly discuss what are the implications of these people with these specific characteristics being in those positions of power. Now, why do we care about local decision-making and local decision makers in the first place? Well, first of all, of course, importantly, even during normal times, these are the people who implement central policies. Even in a highly centralized political environment like Russia, it is still local officials and local bureaucrats who are implementing any kind of central decisions. But interestingly, the last several years gave us even more examples of how during the crisis times, the central authorities are even more likely to delegate some of the unpleasant decision-making, or some of the responsibility and blame to the local authorities. And therefore, local authorities end up being kind of de facto even more powerful than they normally used to be. Both COVID and the current events, specifically the mobilization that was conducted in the regions, are some of the examples of how local authorities actually were able to gain more decision-making power. And a good illustration here on the map is the diversity of specific decisions made by the local authorities, by the regional authorities facing COVID. here we can see, for example, that Russian regions varied a lot in terms of the types of restrictions they had for public events as a response to COVID. So there's a great diversity across the regions, and it is the governors who are making those decisions in this particular case. And also from other research, from social psychology and psychology, we know that things like individual background and personality affect one's behavior. So knowing the characteristics of these people, both their observable characteristics and their internal, maybe less observable personality traits, allows us to predict something about their behavior. That's why we really want to understand who those people are to predict what they will be doing under particular circumstances. Now, in today's talk, I will go through kind of the entire pyramid of Russian administration from top to down, all the way to the local bureaucrats. I will start from subnational political elites. And here I'll be talking about governors and mayors, elections, appointments, different ways they're put in their positions, and how that affects the qualities that we observe among those individuals, those officials. Then I will be talking about so-called invisible effects of selection. Besides the things that we observe easily in terms of the characteristics of those officials, what are some of the other things that we can predict based just merely on the institutions used for their selection? And here I will introduce the notion of risk aversion and discuss why it is so important to understand whether people in those positions will be more risk averse or more risk seeking. Finally, I will descend all the way to local bureaucracy. This is the most numerous part of the Russian state. It's basically everywhere. And again, I will look at the characteristics of those individuals, who they are, but also how they are promoted, how they are retained within the bureaucracy, what kind of qualities are encouraged by the system. And finally, I will very briefly discuss some of the consequences. What are the policy implications of those specific characteristics among those types of officials? And here I will stop specifically on the policy of mobilization in the Russian regions. Now, we will start with the governors. Now, institutions and characteristics. Long story short, since 2012, Russian governors are, again, after some brief period of appointments, popularly elected. But there are some important caveats about the way those elections are conducted. And we will see that basically reflected in their qualities as well. Most importantly, after 2012, even though gubernatorial elections were returned, the opposition is de facto prevented from running in those elections, or it's made very difficult for the opposition to run. There are additional procedures required. Basically, that makes it very, very difficult for any opposition candidates to actually run for gubernatorial positions. And therefore, we end up with governors looking very much pro-regime altogether. And to look at the specific characteristics of the governors, I just selected all the current governors. Those are 81. I excluded the heads, the mayors of St. Petersburg and Moscow, which are not only regions, but also cities, so it's a little bit different. And also all of the annexed territories. So 81 actual territories of the Russian Federation. The graph here in the bottom demonstrates the first year that those governors were in office. So when did the current governors come in office? And what we see here pretty clearly is that most of the currently serving governors in Russia came to office pretty recently, after 2018, right? So there's not a lot of long-serving governors. There have been a concerted effort on the part of the central authorities to replace those kind of regional heavyweights with its appointees, specifically in the recent years, right? So what are the characteristics of those current governors? We're looking specifically at those 81 individuals. What's going on with them? Now, the graph on top there on the right demonstrates a share of governors by cohort. So there are 4 cohorts among the current governors, right? And these are their characteristics and their political background. And what we see very clearly in this like very scissors-like graph is that the more recent the cohort, the less political experience do those individuals have. Basically, it's very, very unlikely that they have any prior political elected experience. Whereas earlier governors were very likely to have served as deputies in the State Duma, at the national legislature, or have served in the regional legislatures, or be elected mayors, right? So this situation becomes less and less likely. So for more and more governors, this appointment or election as governor is actually the first ever political position. And again, as I said, those elections can't really consider truly fully elections. They're definitely very unfair and biased against the opposition, right? And there's another interesting characteristic there that I really wanted to talk about, and this is the proportion of governors who were first appointed as RIOs. So RIO is a cool term. It is basically a temporary appointee. So how that happens? Say there is a governor in a region, and for some reason, this governor is resigning or is dismissed. Can be for a variety of reasons. Maybe the governor is dismissed by the central authorities, or maybe it's time for this governor to actually step down because of the term limit or something like that. But importantly, that happens not at the time of the end of term. It happens a few months before, maybe a couple of months before. The central authorities in this situation basically appoint a temporary appointee who serves for a couple of months and then runs in the subsequent elections as a de facto incumbent. So that situation, when the replacement of a governor actually happens when one of the contestants is a de facto incumbent, is becoming, as you see, incredibly commonplace. And in an overwhelming majority of cases, people like that win. So that's basically just a mechanism to guarantee the support of the central authorities to a specific candidate and make sure that this candidate wins in the following elections, right? So with time, with among the more recent cohorts of governors, this is becoming more and more prominent. Not only do they have little previous political experience, elected experience, their election as governor is also less and less likely to be competitive or actually be an actual election. It is more likely to be this like specific hybrid procedure where first they are appointed and then elected through the popular election. And the second graph below this one demonstrates the share of governors in a specific cohort that have no connection to the region. And two specific indicators here are whether a governor was born in the region, and the second one, the orange line, shows whether the governor worked in the region immediately prior becoming a governor. So what we see is that there is an increasing, a very high actually, share of governors who were not born in the region where they become governor, and also who haven't worked there prior to becoming a governor, right? So they're outsiders. Very often they have experience working in the federal bureaucracy, and that's how they actually get the necessary connections to be appointed as a governor. There are some ridiculous cases among those governors. There is one governor who is currently the governor of the 4th region in a row, right? So basically a person is shifted from one region to another, having no connections to those regions whatsoever. All right, so what is happening to the mayors? Going one level down from governors to the mayors. There are several thousands of municipalities in Russia, and I focus here on so-called first-level municipalities. Those are cities, towns, and districts that contain like second-level municipalities, being like small settlements and villages and so on, right? So only thinking about larger municipalities. This is a graph from a report written by Kirill Konstantsov and Alexander Romantsov in 2020, a very famous one. They have a systematic survey of all the Russian municipalities showing the proportion of mayors that is directly elected and the proportion of mayors that are appointed through a variety of procedures. And as you see, while in 2006, at the beginning of their observations, the majority of the Russian municipalities at this level had directly elected mayors, were elected by the population. This situation is becoming increasingly rare, especially when we compare it to the end result, 2018, where the overwhelming majority of mayors are actually appointed through some kind of indirect procedures, either by local council or most often by a commission with a heavy involvement of the regional governor. So we have the elections that are just like altogether replaced by an appointment procedure. Now, when we look at the characteristics of those mayors, observable characteristics of those mayors, what do we see? Like, what is the difference between elected and appointed mayors. What are the effects of this replacement of direct elections with appointments if we think about the individual characteristics? And what we see here is that those non-elected mayors, appointed mayors, which are more and more numerous as time goes, are much more likely to have worked in the regional administration. So this kind of mirrors situation with the governors being more likely to have worked in the federal bureaucracy, right? So basically being sent from the higher level to the local level. They have little to no electoral experience. Again, this is very similar to what we see with the governors. Previously elected mayors very often had some kind of elected experience, like serving in the local council, for example, right? For the appointed mayors, this is no longer the case. They are much less likely to have this kind of experience. At the same time, and a huge difference with the governors here is that mayors are still mostly insiders. So true outsiders are very, very rare, irrespective of the way they are actually selected in their position. Now, so all of those were about some kind of observable differences and observable characteristics of the state officials. What about the unobservable? This is something that I was really interested in and did for my dissertation. So, okay, so what we see at the subnational level is that subnational elections, say gubernatorial elections, are demonstrating deteriorating quality with more and more barriers for opposition. And the federal level control over the outcome is also increasing. So basically, they're kind of trying to kill the uncertainty associated with elections, which is funny because normally elections are all about uncertainty. We don't know who wins in the end. That's the whole point of having them. But this is exactly what is not allowed to happen in subnational elections in Russia. And also at the local level, there's just outright cancellation of some elections, specifically the mayoral elections, right? So I was curious, what happens if we do something like that? But it's really hard to study something like this in a real environment where there's so many intervening characteristics. So what happens if we do this in a controlled environment of a lab? That's when basically you bring people together in a controlled environment and they interact according to the rules you set for them, right? And specifically, I was interested in two things that are happening in Russian subnational institutions and trying to figure out how those will affect individual behavior of potential candidates. First of all, we know that the opposition candidates face harsher and harsher conditions and steep costs of participating in subnational elections, whereas the pro-regime candidates face low costs, right? So where elections are still preserved, basically, subnational elections, they are unfair. And secondly, we also know that on many occasions, specifically at the local level, elections are canceled altogether, which means that there is no direct accountability of the official to the population. This mechanism is just broken and replaced by the accountability to mostly the regional administration. Now, I was asking myself, how would that affect people's decision to become public officials in the first place? What if there is some kind of unseen mechanism that leads to self-selection very early on, and some people just decide not to go for public office altogether, and we're just losing certain qualities at the entrance before those people even reach the public office? So I was able to conduct an experiment like that, and these are the results. Basically, what I discovered is that, imagine I call it the self-selection of the cautious. Cautious is a more kind of popular term for risk aversion. Risk aversion means that a person is uncomfortable with risk. A risk-averse person tries to avoid risky situations, right? Whereas a risk-seeking person is okay with risk and okay making risky decisions. Now, imagine that you're a risk-averse person. So what will you do when you're considering a political career? Well, if there is accountability to the citizens, that increases the risk of this position. And therefore, you will be less likely to run for a position like that. I demonstrated that where we have elections, risk-averse people are less likely to run, and our candidate pool will be more likely to be more risk-seeking on average. Also, if you're facing very high cost of participation, so say you're very risk averse, but also you support Yabloko. So you're in a position in Russia, right? But you also know that running as a Yabloko candidate is extremely hard. It will be very hard for you to collect necessary signatures, to get resources, to get publicity, and to actually do that. So it's very probable, if you're like a persuaded oppositionist, basically, that you actually will also decide not to run. So risk-averse individuals decide not to run if they're in opposition under a fair elections. Now, what about the situations where they are willing to run? What kind of situations will actually encourage these cautious people still to go for a public office? And again, there are two types of situations here. Well, first of all, if there is no accountability to citizens. So in an appointed position, there is no accountability to the citizens, the position is much safer, and even the most risk-averse individuals are more likely to go for it, right? And finally, if the costs are very low, and this is a situation of pro-regime candidates in the election. Costs are very low, you all but guaranteed your victory. Say you this kind of de facto incumbent in gubernatorial elections, right? Costs for you are very low. So even if you're very risk averse, you're still going to go for it. So there is this kind of interesting mechanism of self-selection coupled with selection where we have risk averse individuals ending up in certain positions. Now, just kind of discussing the consequences of that, basically, what we have in the end is that the governors, who are mostly, because of the specific institutions they're facing, pro-regime candidates in unfair elections, governors are more likely to be risk averse. That is my prediction based on that research. Mayors who are appointed, therefore facing no accountability to the citizens whatsoever, are also more likely to be risk averse. There is one interesting category of people who are more likely to be risk seeking. And these are the opposition candidates who still decide to go for political offices, even under the unfair elections. Because their costs are so high, all the risk averse among them actually decide to withdraw. And we end up with a pretty risk-seeking pool, very daring pool of individuals. And I think it's not coincidental that, especially during the recent events, we've seen some municipal council members, like of course Eurasia here, who's now serving a 70-year term for opposing the war during the local council meeting, or those municipal council members in St. Petersburg who started a petition for Putin resignation. It's not coincidental that we have people like that. There is basically self-selection. And the risk-seeking people among the opposition who actually still decide to compete under unfair elections, they are more likely to be like that and to behave in a certain way. So in terms of the consequences of this kind of self-selection for further decision-making, we know that risk-averse individuals at a time of crisis, they're generally, they prefer the status quo. That will be one consequence for their kind of decision-making, for their behavior. And also, by definition, they don't make risky decisions or some kind of innovative decisions unless the reward is very, very, very high. This is just definition of risk-averse behavior. You only do risky things if the reward for it is very, very high. So the question is it high? And I will return to that in the last slide of this presentation. But for now, I will also talk a little bit about the subnational bureaucracy. So go in one level below. Talk about governors, mayors, and now the bureaucracy. I mean, I saved it to the last, but actually it's a huge number of people. So here the graph on the right shows the number of civil servants by a level, and you see that the total number is over 1 million individuals. And that's only people who are actually in the civil servant positions. So that doesn't include some of the temporary positions and contract workers, which increase that number even higher. So the number of bureaucrats in Russia is huge, which makes sense because the country is so large, of course. And it's important to understand who they are and what they do, because for most of the individuals and most of the citizens of Russia, this is the first and basically only point of contact with the state. Their whole experience with state and state services and state policies will be framed by their interaction with those people. So we really need to know who they are and what kind of behaviors we should expect from them. At the same time, this is the population that's really hard to study. So we're very lucky that we're able to conduct a survey of those people last year, local bureaucrats in Russia, and ask them some questions about what they think about their attitudes and what they think about the bureaucracy and the way it works. So some descriptive characteristics of the bureaucrats, again, because we discussed that for both governors and mayors, the embeddedness in the region is very high. So most of bureaucrats, particularly the municipal ones, were born in the particular region where they work and were educated there. And when we look at their previous experience, they also are more likely to have worked even in the same municipality. Like municipal officials are very likely to have worked in the same municipality they're currently working in. So they're highly embedded in a particular community that they are serving, right? Now, the second part is about prior experience. And that was actually somehow unexpected. Actually, it appears that the overwhelming majority, about 80% of people, come into bureaucracy having some prior experience. Only 20% come right from the university, for example, having no prior experience in private or public sector, whereas the majority of them actually do have some experience before that. Now, one of the questions, and we had to formulate it in a very particular way to gather those numbers, we're happy to discuss that in the Q&A section, was about the promotion criteria. So, okay, we understand what kind of people come into bureaucracy, right? They are embedded in the region, they have very often some external experience, only some of them actually don't. But what happens to them after that? And specifically, what kind of qualities are encouraged by the system by rewarding individuals with those qualities with promotion within bureaucracy? And what we found here, again, is also pretty interesting. First of all, things like education and experience matter. Better education, such as education in Moscow or St. Petersburg, makes you more likely to get promoted, almost 6% more likely. Work experience prior to civil service, a trait that we observed in a lot of those individuals, also makes you more likely to get promoted, especially if it's experience in the public sector. But at the same time, we also found a very, very important role that the personal ties play in the promotion decisions, right? So if you personally know your future supervisor, the probability of you getting promoted for the specific position increases by almost 15%. So personal ties are very important. And most importantly, when we look at the interaction of those things, the qualifications, say, experience, and the personal connections act as a necessary condition. So if you do have personal connections, all of those things give you a head start. But if you don't, your previous experience won't make you more promotable, right? So that's what I call selection of the best among the connected. So it's not selection of the best, it's not selection of the worst. It's a very interesting combination of two, right? So in the first round, we go for those who are connected, and then among those, we get the best and most qualified. Now, of course, now we know the characteristics of these individuals, we know the institutions they're working within. What about their attitudes? Like, how do those correspond to the institutions they have to work within? And as you will see, the picture here is selected for a reason. Now, we had two questions that I kind of put here, answers to which I put here that were particularly telling. In one question, we asked our respondents, can you situate your opinion on a scale between two statements? One is hard work leads to success, and the other one, it's not hard work, it's all luck and personal connections, right? And here on the left, two bar charts on the left basically demonstrate the agreement with the statement, oh, it's hard work that leads to success. As you see, there is some variation within the bureaucracy, and most importantly, that variation runs along the age and career orientation lines. So younger individuals, specifically those who are 30 and younger, are much more likely to say, yes, hard work leads to success. And when we look at their career preferences, it is the people who want to stay in the bureaucracy in 5 years also say, yes, hard work leads to success, not personal connections. So it seems that cynicism increases with age. But what's also good, it seems that this kind of cynicism is mostly carried by people who want to leave the bureaucracy anyway or want to retire. So I don't know, I find some kind of reasons for partial optimism in that particular finding. And of course, another one also was interesting was about the values. So there we asked them to express their agreement with the statement that country's future depends on regular people, like ordinary people, right? And here again, we see some differences in terms of age, and younger people are more likely to agree with that statement. And also people who plan to stay within the bureaucracy are also more likely to agree with that statement. So while providing grounds for some kind of optimism in terms of values and orientations among the bureaucracy, it also seems that there is a certain clash between those values and the institutions that they have to work within. Because institutions seem to, first of all, prioritize personal connections and then qualifications, whereas their beliefs are really in favor of qualifications, not personal connections. So there is a potential conflict here, and that's kind of one of the findings that definitely is interesting. Now, just the main takeaways. And again, going just in the order of the presentation, I started with the governors. What we see is the governors are increasingly outsiders elected with low uncertainty, or increasingly outsiders elected in unfair elections. So that's what's happening at this level. Mayors are increasingly appointed, but insiders. So a little bit different profile here. I also talked about self-selection and the fact that mayors and governors are more likely to be risk averse. And the only category where we're more likely to see risk-seeking people is this kind of opposition individuals who still were able to run and win elections. Most likely in local councils, municipal councils, much less likely other positions. And finally, when we're talking about bureaucrats are very much locally embedded. They have previous experience in the region and municipality where they're from. The promotion pattern could be summarized as promotion of the best among the connected. And finally, there is this potential tension between the attitudes, particularly among the younger cohorts of the bureaucrats and the institutions that they are working in. Now, just a brief discussion of some of the implications. Here I'll be talking about governors and mayors, particularly because they are the ones, the actors that have some say in this particular policy process. So as you know, September 20th, Putin declares partial mobilization in Russia. Governors are the heads of the mobilization commissions at the regional level. Mayors are heads of mobilization commissions at the local level. So they have some say, but generally not an overwhelming amount of it. The center was kind of used a similar tactic to what we saw during COVID. Basically, it was incredibly ambiguous. This presidential decree that declared mobilization didn't state the actual number of the people to be mobilized, didn't state the categories of individuals who had to be mobilized, didn't have any details at all. And also at no point there were any publication from the center as to how many people should be mobilized from each region, right? So that was a very deliberately promoted ambiguity in the way this all was managed from the top down. And also just what we know from our background understanding of the Russian administration, there is really no risk reward. So basically, again, from the overall context, both governors and mayors can face harsh punishments if they break the rules. So there are various examples of mayors and governors being criminally persecuted for breaking specific procedures. And there's no examples of people being rewarded for taking a risk, breaking a procedure, but achieving the result. That's really not the logic of the Russian bureaucracy. It's all about following the procedure. So that's exactly what they were doing. So as I said, both governors and mayors are more likely to be risk averse. And the behavior we see in this case is definitely consistent with our general expectation from risk aversion. As I said, both of those groups of officials were fully following directions, trying not to be too visible in a way. They provided no clarifications. Because that would definitely be kind of taking responsibility on themselves. They don't want that. That is a very risky strategy. Because today you say that maybe your city needs to mobilize 200 people, and tomorrow the center increases your task, and you're the one to blame. So again, they were providing no clarifications, and the governors also, there were several occasions when the governors were passing the blame to the lower levels of the bureaucracy, to their military commissions, and so on. Right now, the things that is different between the governors and the mayors is whether they're outsiders or insiders, and that seems to have also been consequential in terms of their behavior. So governors, as I said, they are outsiders. They are much more likely to have experience working in the federal bureaucracy, and their main audience, in a way, in a situation like that, is mostly the federal center, not really their local population. So we see immediately after Putin's declaration of mobilization, and sometimes even preemptively, governors making these public enthusiastic statements about how they support that and how they will do everything to actually basically reach the necessary goals and perform on this particular task. And them being the outsiders also explains why some of them were really making some pretty obvious faux pas. For example, a rural region governor was caught being incredibly inconsistent, where first he said that there will be no payments to the mobilized, caused an outrage. Then he said that, oh, there won't be payments because we will provide everything. People were still unhappy. Then he said that, oh, there will be payments, because obviously he needed to do something with his public opinion, which he seemed to be totally out of touch with. And in the end, there was a video of the basically of the equipment bought by the regional authorities, and the mobilized individuals were like showing how low quality this equipment was, and that caused basically what I can only characterize as a tantrum, a public tantrum of the governor on social media, how unhappy he is of this kind of treatment from his own population. So these kind of lack of touch is definitely characteristic of somebody who's not really understanding what's going on in their region where they actually supposed to govern. Whereas mayors who, as we know, are a little bit more embedded in the local communities, they, first of all, they show much less public enthusiasm. They're much less likely to be caught in this kind of statements. But also their individual efforts to protect certain groups or individuals at this kind of local level. So there was a mayor of Nizhnevartovsk, who helped to return a couple of wrongly mobilized individuals, basically help their families to bring them back. So they're much more connected to these kind of community actors. So okay, this is a brief discussion of the consequences. I'll be happy to talk about that a little bit more and answer any questions you might have at this point. Thank you.
So I'll kick things off with the first question. Fascinating talk, and just the scope of it all is just really kind of breathtaking. How many officials you can speak intelligently about. It seems like a pretty miserable job to be a Russian bureaucrat these days, especially when you outline it in terms of there's no risk reward, you're only going to incur the wrath of higher level officials. And you didn't really talk as much about like, what does that do to self-selection? And when do we get good versus bad bureaucrats? Beyond the risk aversion element to things, why does anyone want to join some of these higher level positions if they're just going to get slapped down when they make a mistake? Is it corruption? Is it just a thirst for power? How does the Russian government continue to ever attract talented individuals if it doesn't seem like there's a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow after all of this suffering and bureaucracy? So how does it reproduce itself if it seems so strict and rigid with just cliffs all around you that you're trying not to stumble off?
Thank you. That is a wonderful question. I asked myself so many times, especially when doing fieldwork and talking to mayors. My question was basically, there seems to be no reason to have this position or like want it. Why are you still doing it? I mean, some of them are just like seriously wanted to serve their communities at some point. They just continue on that. Some of them, of course, probably have those kind of corrupt considerations. As for governors, the funny part is there is anecdotal evidence that particularly lately, it's becoming harder and harder for Kremlin to actually get replacement governors. Because as you know, what happens is like behind the scenes, there's this process where they find some kind of candidate and offer him the position. I say him because in overwhelming majority of cases, that'll be a man. Right? And the person can say yes or no. I mean, of course, there's some kind of voluntary element to that. Nobody's forced, absolutely forced. But some of the recent occasions when people were replaced, they are saying that there were 5 or 6 people who said no before they found somebody who would agree. That just like, I hope partially respond and answers this question. There seems to be like incredibly short supply of individuals who are actually willing to do that. And I'm afraid that an increasing number of them would be wanting to do that only for some kind of corrupt reasons. Because again, just the kind of the cost benefit analysis just makes this irrational otherwise. Of course, for the lower level of kind of governance, for bureaucrats especially, it's a little bit different. So there, it can be often the only decent job in a particular locality. So yeah, that's.
Makes a lot of sense. How do we open up to the audience? Question from the back. Can you just introduce yourself before you share your question?
Hi, I'm Ailey Feynman from the State Department. Thanks for the really interesting talk. And I had a few more questions, one sort of probably small and easy to answer, and one maybe that'll take you beyond the talk that you just gave. So first, when you're talking about the risk-averse people, mostly in municipal councils, are you qualifying anyone who's not from United Russia as opposition, or are you thinking specifically about certain parties? That obviously has implications for how risk-averse and how independent they might be, which leads to the bigger question about sort of, do you see in your research, and apologies if this goes beyond what you've looked at, any sort of qualitative difference in municipal councils that have greater proportions of opposition / more risk-averse people? Do you see any role in, or anything happening in those places where there is more diversity in terms of actual exchange of ideas between people inside the ruling party and people outside of it, which then would have implications for a possible pool for alternatives in the future in Russia? So those are the questions.
Yeah. So yes, basically what I'm expecting is that opposition individuals who are still kind of managing to end up in power or some positions within elected positions are more likely to be risk-seeking, right? Because of this self-selection. The risk-averse basically self-selected out of it long ago. Of course, when I'm talking about opposition here, because I'm saying, oh, the opposition faces increased costs and so on, I'm talking about non-systemic opposition, let's say, right? So probably not necessarily KPRF and Strategy Eurasia, but with an important caveat. The situation in the regions is sometimes different. So there are certain local elections where, say, KPRF is really going after United Russia, and there's real competition from them, and United Russia is not helping, let's say, right? So I would say that you really need to look at a specific situation because of that, and that's why I'm not making a kind of an overall statement about that. But in every particular situation, it will be the opposition that is considered the actual opposition by the authorities that will be facing this kind of consequence for the risk aversion.
And then sort of the bigger question about any differences that you sort of think about and see. If you can speak to that, that'd be great.
Right. I mean, again, I can think of some anecdotal evidence that there seems to be, well, councils like that. If you have a municipal council with a significant number of, say, opposition council members, definitely makes life difficult for the local authorities. It does not break the kind of the overall governance system altogether, because the local authorities don't have a lot of power in the first place. The whole system is very centralized, right? But they definitely create this kind of pockets of discussion. So at least they have to voice certain things. At least they have to get some things on the agenda. So yes, I think this is actually a very important development of the past few years. And it's pretty fascinating. I think a lot of people are kind of missing that, what's going on at the local level. And we have a lot of this kind of municipal council members, very young people, like in their 20s, who start running for those positions and really are passionate about it and want to change the politics in the localities. And again, because this is how most of the citizens experience politics in the first place, I think it's very important that this kind of trend continues.
Thank you. Other questions from the audience? In the back.
Thank you very much. My question is, my name is Yaroslav Kaminsky. I'm visiting scholar in Elliott. So, in fact, you tell us a story that the system, in some sense, degrade. Unfortunately. So, how you can describe the future of this system? what you can predict? Thank you.
That is a deep and difficult question. Well, first of all, yes, degrading. I think the system is really struggling to to settle two challenges, because there is a reason Russian central authorities are trying to make those elections so manageable. They're trying to impose political control over the outcomes. That's very important for their political survival, right? So they need to have controllable governors. They need to have very controllable municipal officials, specifically mayors, because they're the ones that are powering up all those local political machines and kind of promoting the necessary voting results. So there is a political goal there, which kind of explains why we actually see these kind of institutional changes. But as I demonstrate, it also has a cost. As a result, you end up with officials who can be paralyzed in a situation of crisis, because these are exactly the people that you selected into there, right? So they were good for you in some ways. They're not a threat. They're very predictable. But when you are in a crisis and the country is in a crisis, that becomes a huge problem, right? So yes, that the system is definitely kind of running into itself in this regard. In terms of prognosis, that is hard. I think an important thing to remember about prognosis is that the part of the state I was actually talking about is very likely to be preserved, especially bureaucracy, especially the municipal level, right? It's just like you won't see this kind of rapid turnover of individuals in those positions. So understanding them is also important because of that. No matter what changes in terms of political regime at the central level, these are the people who still will be there. We will need to take that into account when thinking about reforms, for example, and how willing they will be to implement them. Because again, risk-averse people are not very happy with the reforms.
Hello, my name is Aidan. I'm a visiting scholar at Elliott School. I have two questions. The first one is about the data that you used. For example, you calculate those probabilities. So how big is the data set? Is it a survey, or could you please clarify? And the second question is about ethnic minorities, because there are different regions, and some regions in Russia correspond to certain ethnic minorities like Buryatia, Tatarstan, and are there different patterns in terms of promotion of ethnic minorities in those regions at all those levels, governors, mayors, bureaucracy? Is it different, or is it the same, or some kind of irregularities? Would be also interested to know. Thank you.
Okay, so in terms of ethnic minorities, we did not collect that data in the bureaucratic survey, about the ethnicity of individuals. Plus, it was only one region, so that's an important thing. The bureaucratic survey was conducted in just one region. We're able to cover the entire population of civil servants in this region. So the sample is very large. It's about 2,000 individuals. But it's kind of a snapshot of a average Russia, because that's an average Russian region. It's a ethnically Russian region. So it doesn't tell us much about potentially very different patterns in ethnic republics, for example. Right, there seems to be some anecdotal evidence that in ethnic republics, there might still be the ethnic criteria used for promotions, in some more than others. But yes, we don't have this data, and I don't think anybody else has, at least I haven't run into that. And in terms of the specific sample structure and so on, do you mean the bureaucratic survey or the bureaucracy? Yeah. So yes, for promotion, basically, yes, that was a survey of bureaucrats in Novgorod region conducted in 2021 in June. And as I said, we covered basically almost the entire population with very good response rate. And to get those probabilities of promotion, we used a technique in this survey called a conjoint experiment, where our respondents saw two hypothetical profiles which we just randomly generated. And we asked them to compare and tell us which one of those hypothetical individuals is more likely to be promoted for a specific position, right? And they had a whole series of characteristics like their gender, their family position, their education, their personal ties, some also kind of like personality things like that. And analyzing this allowed us to give those kind of pretty exact percentages of how much each of those traits contributes to the probability of being promoted. Like one of the things that I didn't discuss today, for example, is the gender. There are a lot of very sad results.
That's actually your next question, which is from Zoom. And one of the audience members wanted to know whether you can say something about the gender aspect. You mentioned that the officials you've been studying were mostly male. So any evidence that officials are becoming more predominantly male over time, or is the balance remaining constant, or please share these incredible findings about gender more broadly and speak to that element of the research.
Okay, yes. So governors are, I think there's only one female governor currently in Russia, so that's incredibly rare. For mayors, a little bit less, but still, like an overwhelming majority of mayors are also men. Women are more likely. I mean, again, I don't think I will discover something new here if I say that the higher you get up to any hierarchy, the less women you see, and that's exactly what we see here. Because in our bureaucratic survey, for example, so this is like all the municipal and regional level bureaucrats in a particular region, and women constitute over 80%. So regular, like rank and file bureaucrats are mostly women, overwhelmingly, especially at the municipal level.
Thank you.
I hope we didn't lose this.
Okay, bye.
So they're mostly women. But even within the bureaucracy, once you start climbing the ladder and go into like higher level supervisors, they're much more likely to be men. There are some exceptions, like specific departments, of course. You know, we all know that social policy and healthcare are more likely to be associated. And funnily enough, the different kind of financial departments also in Russia traditionally are kind of very female. But except for that, it's pretty predominantly male. So yes, unfortunately, the higher you get, the more men there is. And I don't know, actually, I think, again, just thinking about the developments into the future and maybe even some kind of pretty distant future, I think the recent developments, the war and the anti-war movement in Russia, I've particularly witnessed some developments of the feminist groups and movements and organizations, and generally kind of feminist and women's agenda. And it's just much more discussed. There's a lot of groups, there's a lot of people, a lot of protesters are also women, an increasing number. And also, even in the particular area of the, say, municipal politics, there are so many of them who are women. Like we know Yulia Ganyamina. We know many others who are very prominent actors who are very visible. And I think they will be shaping the agenda and the discussion at this level a lot, especially because at the time of war, it seems the voice of women becomes more prominent, which is good. Something.
Other questions from the audience? Yeah, super. Well,
Subnational George University. One of the surprising things that the Russian invasion of Ukraine showed, that in spite of Russia being cut off international bank system, all the sanctions, all the hardships, somehow Russia stands there. The bank system works, like the bureaucracy works. And I was wondering if some of the issues you discussed are rather making this system work. So, for example, most of the bureaucrats being risk averse make them more stable. Also, one of the your surveys showed that a lot of bureaucrats, especially younger ones, believe that working hard is a good thing for promotion of your career. And you also, your data showed that the more and more bureaucrats are younger, appointed governors, elected governors and appointed mayors. We can see that in many other countries, when countries encounter such hardship that Russia now faces, the regimes collapse pretty quickly, and we expected that would be the case in Russia as well, and it's not happening. So maybe all these bureaucratic strategies that the Kremlin uses are actually helping the bureaucracy and the regime to survive. So I was wondering, what are your thoughts?
Well, one of the things that maybe helps the adjustment is the fact that the sanctions weren't a surprise to Russia in a way. Russia has been under sanctions for a few years by now and had time to develop certain strategies to cope with them. So maybe that also kind of contributed to this resilience that we're observing. And of course, under any circumstances, the state, the bureaucrats, the officials will be the part of the population that the central authorities will be kind of most willing to appease. Right? So they, in a way, they will be the least likely to feel any kind of hardship that might be a result of the sanctions. So that's kind of one thought about it. And in terms of the bureaucrats, I actually see some kind of potential threat in the fact that younger bureaucrats who are willing to stay in the bureaucracy think that hard work leads to success, because the opposite statement, the one they did not choose, is that success is mostly due to good luck and connections, right? But this is exactly what they seem to observe through the institutions of promotions at workplace. So we might have this kind of generation of bureaucrats who are not at ease with what they're actually observing in the work practice. So that is more of a potential threat than something that would be helpful.
Last round. We'll actually take two, and then we'll give the final word.
I'm Serge Schman, I'm a journalist. This may be a follow-up question to the previous one. You described a process of centralization of the center, gaining more and more control and instituting a more risk-averse management across Russia. But as you've done your field work, have you found that this has been unpopular, popular, or even unnoticed by the population? I mean, I would imagine, and I have not done this kind of field work and not even raised these questions, but quite a few Russians might actually welcome this process and prefer a risk-averse appointed Guzel.
Question in the back, and then we'll.
Hello, my name is Anissa Osbeck, and I'm from the Elliott School. You mentioned with some of your field work, you looked at motivations for people to run to office. And with that, I'm interested in two particular variables, that of prestige and that of finances, especially in relatively underdeveloped sectors of Russia. I'm not sure how regionally diverse your area of study was, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
All right, so I'm sorry, could you rephrase your question maybe like this one? Yes.
Yeah, just how's the public,
Yes,
how has the public reacted as far as you've seen in your field work?
Right, thank you. So there have been a diverse reaction, particularly when we're talking about the cancellation of elections of mayors. There have been protests in some cities, pretty numerous, but in a way, as probably we see in protests against the mobilization or protests against war in Russia too, the share of population that mobilizes is always very small. And the majority of people seem to be acquiesced, but by whatever is going on. At the same time, the surveys specifically demonstrate that people still prefer elections. Like when they're directly asked, how do you want to like select your mayor or governor? Do you think that elections are important? Yes, this value, as a declarative value, is actually very kind of already ingrained in the Russian public opinion, which is kind of an interesting finding, right? So it's still definitely there. I mean, there is a reason that the elections aren't canceled everywhere, and we still have elections for regional legislatures, and we have elections for governors, and the president is still elected, even though like in a very particular way, right? But the procedure is still important. So it seems that it's kind of the level of tolerance of the public is taken into account on that regard. And even though there are certain violations, the procedures themselves are kind of kept alive. And in terms of the kind of variation in motivations for public office, the regions where I kind of directly surveyed the officials and talked to specific, say, municipal officials and mayors, there were only 2 or 3 specific regions. So I had a kind of subsample of mostly economically developed regions, and there my impression was that the kind of the public service motivation, the desire to implement certain policies, were really important among those officials, right? Even though they were all, of course, politically loyal. So, but of course, there are limits to determining the kind of corrupt intentions of individuals through interviews. That's something that we have to do with.
On that note, thank you very much, Guzel, for a fascinating talk. We have to end the formal part of the presentation, but I'm sure Guzel would entertain more questions afterwards. Please feel free to
Absolutely.
say hi. Thank you so much for coming, and I think we're going to take a break until January is our next talk. So enjoy the holiday break, and see you in 2023. Oh my gosh, it's almost the end of the year. I can't believe it. Take care.